So for our final effort here, one might perhaps try to think about where anthropology has been to the extent that I've been part of it, and where it might be going to the extent that I am perhaps part of it, having had a great many students. I'm one of those teachers where I get double teaching evaluations. One bunch says, she's crazy, I have no idea what she's talking about. And the other bunch says, my life will never be the same again, and they mean it positively. Sometimes they come back years later and say, I didn't think I liked that at the time, but boy, it's been useful. So it seems to me that the essence of teaching is critical thought, and that I would be terribly offended to be told that I had disciples, shall we say, as I think anyone who felt strongly about the potential of their discipline would have to be. Last fall at the American Anthropology Association meetings, I did the General Anthropology Division distinguished lecture talking about the Boas Project in a quite, not everything else, but that way. But it also happened to be the year that some of my former students and friends and protégés of other kinds decided to put together two sessions, a session and a roundtable talking about my work. And my favorite piece of that, I mean, a couple of them reduced me to tears, admittedly, but the piece that was most delightful in retrospect was that they called the panel the Regna rhizome. And I like that. There is some kind of sense in which, like the Crabgrass Collective that some of us came up with at CASCA a few years back, there's a tenacity and an inseparability, interwovenness of a rhizome that is much less fragile than a tree where you can just lop off a piece and it's gone. And I think that the world is much more, the world in its practice is much more rhizomatic. The way that I've done that in my own career, I suppose, is through interdisciplinarity. That is, most of the people that I find myself talking to in both of the departments I've been in have not been colleagues in my own department, not because I avoid them, but simply because I and my students are doing something that doesn't seem to be at the center of their interests. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It sometimes makes life complicated. The piece that has kept me sane at the University of Western Ontario is the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism, which is a very interdisciplinary crowd. And I'm sort of was saying recently to the current director, well, you know, I do see myself as kind of an outlier to the Theory Center and what it does. And he says, you know, I think almost everyone who is part of the center feels that way. Because we're all we do this as a graduate program in our spare time and work with the various students in it and teach courses now and again. And I have taught quite regularly for the Theory Center, never the same course twice, in all kinds of crazy well, I've been thinking about this. I think I would enjoy thinking about it for a while with some students and reading some stuff together and talking about how one does that. So just to give you a sample, the first one I did for them was called Science Fiction and the Construction of Ethnography. Now, the Theory Center students all wanted to read the theory, but I couldn't get them to read the science fiction, which drove me nuts. They seemed to want to talk about the idea of science fiction. It was a very small class. But I was quite distressed. There's a lot now. That was 1991 or so. I think that there's a lot more now where science fiction and anthropology have come together, not just writing it, as many did, but also of talking about it as an exercise of imagination that requires anthropological skills of interpretation. What is the consequence of taking this simple premise seriously? And it's an ethnographic logic. I think the writing of Ursula Le Guin, who was the daughter of Alfred Kroeber, is a very good example of that, and I very much admire her writing. Okay, then a couple of the other gems there. Oh yes, then there was the year that my department was all on globalization and how it would overwhelm anything. My course that year for the Theory Center was on indigeneity and resistance to globalization. And I think actually I've turned out to be right. It's sort of like my nomadic legacies argument. These people have not gone away and they have not changed their minds about the alternative that they want to something. That doesn't mean there haven't been hiccups along the way, but really now, globalization has not run over everything for all of its efforts, and I hope will not. And then there was oral tradition, the contingency of representation in the definition of civilization. Yeah. And metaphors of science. That one was about evolution, which we've mostly left behind. Relativism, which I think in great part we have too, or at least we have redefined the implications of, as Ruth Benedict began talking about synergy at the end of her life. And certainly where we've talked about complex societies in other kinds of ways. But I think that the scientific revolution that we are entering, perhaps have been well into, but it hasn't yet hit critical mass, is the one that goes to chaos and complexity kind of thinking. And I am very sure that that will utterly change the way we understand every field. I then went on to do such wonders as, well, let's see, I'll spare you some of them. Narratives of violence and trauma, face-to-facedness and the construction of community. That was the year that everyone in my department was babbling about Benedict Anderson's notion that society is founded on complex societies in the way in which they move beyond individuals who have face-to-face relationships. And I think it's the other way around. And so I wanted to, again, work from the bottom up and try to talk about face-to-facedness and the way in which it was reconstituted in people's lives somewhere within public or private space in complex societies as well as in so-called simple ones. And then we had incommensurability and the problem of translation. That was pretty linguistics. Then I got to do one on Franz Boas and his world for 1 year. And then I wanted to get some public health people to take a course, so we called it Contagion, Plague, and Public Health, and began by reading Albert Camus' The Plague, which is a beautiful book. I hadn't read it for a long time, but it's a beautiful piece of anthropological analysis of the psychological process of living under quarantine and possible sentence of death. And then the one that I did last fall is entitled Qualitative Method Must Be Defended with Apologies to Foucault, which is not really very apologetic. But what we've been trying to do is to say that the Academy has in some very serious way sold out to the idea that the STEM disciplines that bring in money and have a positivist methodology are the only things that count. And on virtually every campus, there has been a marginalization of the humanities and social sciences. And that's simply wrong. Anything that we acknowledge about a complex world and a complex ecosystem is going to force us to attend in more than a positivist way to the way the world works. And some of the theoretical work that is moving in those directions is really interesting. I got recently, because I agreed to review it, over 1,000 pages by Nancy Turner in 2 volumes on the plants of Western North America, mostly British Columbia. The frigging thing doesn't have an index, so it's a tad hard to use. But the amount of information about the way in which plants are, other than human beings, in animate relationship to that intersection of social and natural world, which is almost certainly artificial. And the way in which we must come, so that's one tangent. And then there's the whole animal human relations stuff, which the people in Aberdeen have done some neat things with recently. That's a whole set of things that have to be thought about and rethought completely, because this human thing is not really the point. Humans are certainly in many ways different from those other people, those other beings who share the world. Pete Hallowell always talked about other than human beings in his still quite contemporary Ojibwe ethnography. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. And so one can begin to look for ways to talk about things that are not exclusively cognitive and that are not exclusively verbal. So if we begin to see not language but communication as the issue, and communication is a kind of intersectionality. That seems to be the current buzzword, but they change over time. So that one has a much more interestingly reaching out from any set of data. And one of the ways that we get at directions that might reach, I think, is through ethnography. When anthropologists work in a range of really different kinds of communities, they come back and talk to these philosophers and grand theorists of blah, 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 and are able to say, yes, but what about this? Do we have to change the theory to account for this that we see people doing? Well, yes. And there are some kinds of theories that can be invalidated by a single counterexample, and others where we talk about what Roman Jakobson called near universals, things that usually go together, and in which we have a sense of that making things go together as being the essence of being human, but also of being in some kind of balance with the rest of it. I am a realist in the sense that I think there's a world out there and that it has intractable properties. I do not, however, think that we are capable of understanding or perceiving it in an unmediated fashion, which is why the more we know about how other beings perceive or react to it, the more likely we are to be able to add up something that may make sense, that has a rhizomatic coherence. It's that tensile strength of hybridity kind of question again. And I think we need a whole new vocabulary, because almost all of the words that we use to talk about social order and human communities are terribly biased. The hierarchy that's built into them is absolutely frightening. And to try and rejig the meaning of conventional words or to come up with new terms is really tough stuff. There are a whole bunch of philosophers, more of them French than anything else, but all over the place, who have come up with some really interesting ways of beginning to poke at that. I read them a lot, and I make my fourth year theory courses read stuff like that, and they howl blue murder. But those are the ones that come back 5 years later and say, boy, am I glad you made me fight out my way through Deleuze when I was an undergrad, because I didn't have to do it later. That's okay. In a sense, he's doing the same kind of thing that Boas did with his history and psychology. Volume 1 of Deleuze and Guattari is anti-Oedipus. It's how do we understand where psychoanalysis got off the track with its ideas about the universal psychodynamic and its relationship to creativity. And then in A Thousand Plateaus, we have a much more historicist, in a thematic rather than a chronological way, treatment of how people asking different kinds of questions can ask them in ways that are very similar. And I find that a really useful approach. There was a stretch when my department rolled their eyes in unison every time I said the word rhizome. That hasn't happened for a while. So I'm optimistic that perhaps all of us are beginning to see some of these things. I'm currently on sabbatical, and I have, at various past times, been in a position that I don't have to teach, and had students who don't want me not to teach. Usually graduate students, occasionally some undergraduates. So there was one, I think it was 2006 to 8, The university came up with a scheme that they were going to schedule classes centrally, and that they didn't care what time we wanted, what days we wanted, or the size of the blocks we wanted. Now, I do not do well in hour classes. I get warmed up with my train of thought and try to draw the students into talking to me about something. An hour doesn't do it. And so I want 3-hour blocks. I want them on preferably Monday and Tuesday so that I can go to weekend conferences and still do my teaching responsibly. And I don't want first thing in the morning because I'm catatonic. Okay. So I was sufficiently irritated to apply for a Killam Research Fellowship, which buys out all of your teaching for 2 years. And I got it. So every time a senior bureaucrat at Western congratulated me on the Killam, I explained to them why I applied. Okay, now it meant that I wasn't allowed to teach. So I used about half the money they gave me to hire one of my buddies to teach some of my classes, but they wanted him to teach 4 courses, an Indigenous fellow, and I wanted him to finish his dissertation of 15 years before, which he could still submit if he did. He still hasn't, but it was a really enriching kind of 2 years for him that he did that and was involved. And he camped out in my back room when he was here for the teaching, and it went just fine. From my point of view. And then the rest of it we dumped into research funding for students, basically. Put it in a research account, not money that simply came to me. But in the process, I taught what I called a non-class. The non-class was, when I'm in town, because I may travel more than usual, I will be pleased to meet with anyone who wants to come to talk about whatever anyone wants to talk about. And so we did that for 2 years. I had an average of about 8 and never less than 6, and sometimes as many as 12 or 14. The second year became a little less of a, I've been reading this thing and I want to talk to some people about it, and a little more of people talking about how to put their own work together. So in part a reading support group for PhD students. I had some physical anthropology students in that one, which I thought was kind of neat too. It's good stuff. And some of these ways of thinking about how you communicate ideas and what kinds of things you need to say between, I think I understand how this works, and I have to explain it to someone else. That's a huge step in terms of writing. And for me, that's a step you make by talking to people and by thinking out loud. So first advice to students writing a dissertation, start in the middle. First you get down what you want to say about your own research and its results. Then we'll go back and frame it, kind of like the layers of an onion. What do we have to know in order to make sense out of this? And I think that works much better. In terms of my own writing, the odds are that I will think something out talking to a class, and then I will move on to giving a conference paper. And then I will write it up in one way or another. So eventually one gets to a point of writing a formal article or perhaps putting something into a book or a larger project. And I think it takes that kind of mulling over a period of time to get anything to come together well. I've also done a huge amount of research and writing in collaboration with colleagues, former students, interdisciplinary partners, and organized a lot of conferences because I find that sitting down with people who share, people where I don't have to explain how I got to something I want to think about because I know them well enough that they'll go, oh yeah, okay, and we just start talking about it. And I think it's that is the pleasure and the privilege of working in the academy. One has a day job and a great deal of flexibility about how it's going to work out in practice. I am currently this semester on sabbatical, and I am yet again running a non-class. The core of it is about 5 people. We sometimes get as many as 7 or 8. And we've decided we want to talk about ontology, this thorny problem of the fact that philosophers think ontology means that it's monolithic. and that anything that has variability must be merely epistemological. And Pete Hallwell back in the 30s and 40s was talking already about Ojibwe ontologies. And I think he was right. There's something terribly patronizing about saying that what someone thinks is simply an epistemology. When you talk about ontology, you're talking about something that's real, because the way that it is constructed as an ontology has consequences in the world, and there's no question that those are real. So I think we need to be thinking in that kind of respectful of the there-ness and the existence of some of the kinds of things that we think about. So we're reading everything from Donna Haraway and Judith Butler to Grand Theory. I believe we're talking about Agamben next time, but I wasn't entirely sure which direction they wanted to go. And that's a question of how do we come up with a new umbrella for the kinds of things it's urgent to think about in a way that allows for activism and standpoint, but that is also respectful of diversity and community. And I think it's a collaborative enterprise that must cross disciplines and communities and certainly the kinds of scientific vocabularies we use. And I think that the language of complexity and chaos is going to give us, and I don't think it's entirely metaphorical. Metaphors are simultaneously real and figurative, whereas literary critics tend to think that we're talking about the metaphor, and they never mention where it came from again after making the statement. That's not the way, certainly not the way indigenous thought works. And I think that we're going to have to concentrate much more on finding metrics of calibration among ways of thinking about things, across ontologies, if you wish. My motto is, I have no idea what you just meant. We have to talk about it some more. And so let's talk about it some more is the kind of motto of intellectual understanding, I think. Sometimes it's let's read some more of what somebody else said. Sometimes it's let's go out and talk to people. Sometimes it's let's think with a group of students. But it's applying that kind of process to the work one does. The substance or the content is a very incidental kind of thing in the sense that opportunities arise and you take them. I've taken the large majority of the opportunities that have come my way. I think that if we get right down to what are the issues I care most about, that ontology epistemology is one, the individual and the group and the nature of aesthetics and creativity is another, and that theory tested against what happens in the world is another. And then this whole idea that all useful work is likely to be collaborative in one sense or another. The poetics kind of thing has always been a sort of side tangent. I'm a terrible poet, in the same sense that Edward Sapir was a terrible poet. I've published a few, but not many. And they're all ethnographic. But as an ethnographic poetic, I could never write a monograph on the Plains Cree of northern Alberta. It doesn't hang together that way. But if I use a poetic structure to talk about something that happened, so an event piece or an idea or a reflection or a description of a person, then people will often say to me, oh, that was your experience, you mean? Well, yeah. Oh, that's okay. And it's the same comment would be there if I were indigenous, which I'm certainly not and have never claimed to be. But the kind of, you can talk about your own experience and what you understood or didn't understand and how that changed over time. So by using a series of kind of what I called ethnographic vignettes it's in my papers somewhere, and I will decide whether to burn it someday. But it was as a mechanism to avoid the hierarchy that's implicit in social science writing of a conventional type. That's the, for me, most important thing that came out of the postmodernist frenzy a couple of decades ago. In high school, my English teacher, who was a real role model and influence on my thinking, used to draw flowers in the margins of some of my papers. And you can do that now. You're allowed to play with language. And I like that. I think that the anecdotal, in the sense that Kenneth Burke, literary critic, Kenneth Burke, mother of Eleanor Burke Leacock, wrote about representative anecdotes. That is, choose the particular story that will make your point. Your audience will remember that. They'll forget all the data and statistics and tables you gave them. They can look that up if they really want to know. That's why we have libraries and internet systems, and that's okay. What you need to know is how to think about what's out there. And it's stories that will do that, and direct experiences. And so I think that the poetic mode allows us, at least in our tradition, to suspend some of the assumptions that would dismiss arguments or points of view in a different format that can be heard when they're put in this kind of a format. And that seems to be something that ought to be pursued. There was a stretch when both linguistics and anthropology were on this kick of people who write poetry in the 90s when I did a bit of this. The linguists all wrote poetry about everything under the sun. Almost all of the anthropologists wrote about their ethnography. So you could just, who doesn't draw a line between their work and their life? Well, it's us guys, It's the world and we're in it. And that, I think, is the essence of the anthropology that I would like to see continue. I hope I'm right.